Sorry, I run out of juice. Part 2. But then he turned to guitars, and his theory was that you should put so much art and skill into making guitars. He went against this parlour idea of just having a flat top guitar made out of very nice wood that vibrated nicely. But his idea was that you should carve the top, and they were called arch top, these guitars. If we can probably see it, let me just try and move the camera around to the side so you can see the shape of this one. Maybe you can, maybe you can't. And some of his very early guitars, he carved the top out of one piece of wood, and then he carved the back and sides. He scooped them out to make the back and sides out of one piece of wood, because his theory was, quite correctly, that the more wood you can get to vibrate on its own without being encumbered by things stuck to it, and one piece rather than 3 pieces would vibrate much better and create much more resonance, much more sound, with quality wood being used. But of course that was very, very expensive to do. By 1902, 03, 04, he obviously couldn't afford to do that anymore, and he sold out to 3 businessmen who could see the potential for his guitars, but obviously they had to cut the costs a little bit. And so he and they started producing some slightly more saleable guitars, one of which was this one. This was made in 1915. They'd been around for about 5 years, and it was at the top of the range, and it was called the Style O Artist, and it's the most beautiful guitar. It's got this lovely decoration around the sound hole. It's got a lovely curly bit there, and then this sort of long cutaway. It's a lovely guitar. It plays beautifully. It really does. I think it's my favourite guitar in many ways. So that was one of Gibson's very early guitars. As time went on, of course, they realised that they just had to make some cheap ones because the demand was picking up, and the guitar was getting so popular for lots and lots of reasons. There were influences from Hawaii, for one thing, because Hawaii had become an American protectorate, and they came over, and people saw these new styles of playing. There was the Spanish Figaro students came over, and they had a kind of mandolin band, and soon it went out. The publicity was that they couldn't read music, but they were so fantastic. So there was this big craze in the early 1900s for playing in groups with all these foreign influences. People thought, well, we could do that. Why not? Let's form some bands. Let's all get together and play music on these guitars. But of course, not everyone could afford these. So fairly soon, Gibson, like so many others, like Washburn and others, realised that they just had to make slightly cheaper models. And so they did. So the first attempts, this is my one of my lovely guitars that I play all the time. It goes everywhere with me, this guitar. This was made in 1918, and this was the Gibson L1. And you can probably see it's still got an arched top. You can see by the way the light's reflecting off it. But it's a good bit smaller, much nearer to the old parlour size. You can see these early Gibsons had the Gibson written on the top, not Gibson. But they were smaller and they were cheaper. And this was the L1. They made an L2 and an L3 and an L4. But by the time the 1920s came along, they realised that they'd got to make them even cheaper. These carved arch tops were very expensive to produce. So they finally had to sort of comply with what everybody else was doing to keep the costs down. And they made flat top versions. So there was an L1 flat top and an L2 flat top, much cheaper to make. And eventually in the 1930s, they produced much, much cheaper flat tops. One of which was this one. This was called the LOO. And it was that bottom of the range that LO wasn't enough. It had to be LOO just to indicate that it really was quite cheap. This is a lovely guitar. It's got a beautiful sound. But this is a shining example of the fact that even Gibsons, who had this standard and they really wanted to make these beautiful guitars, just had to give in. They wanted to meet public demand, and they just couldn't go on producing these very expensive guitars. The other very clever thing that Gibson did was that they increased the demand by appointing these sales agents to go out and teach communities how to play the guitar. And in doing so, they would make these sort of hire purchase deals with the guitar. So they would teach them how to play in these little groups, And Gibson were very proud of the results. And there were loads of published pictures of these local communities forming these groups, all playing Gibson guitars and all having lessons from the Gibson guitar salesman. So Gibson were very, very clever in increasing the demand that was already very high. What was happening though, because of all this, is that there was an increasing demand not just for very nice guitars and very cheap guitars, but louder guitars, because this was the 1920s now we're talking about, when there was a huge taste for music. You know, it was cinemas, record players, the Victrola gramophones, transport, everything was getting to a point in America in the 1920s, not just America, but mostly in America, where there was this demand for instruments you could play in bands and groups and dance bands. And so there was a demand for things to be much, much louder than they had been. And so this struggle to get louder guitars started. Now, it followed two strands, really. One strand was started by Martin, in effect, in that they made these much bigger guitars. But one of the big breakthroughs was Gibson. And Gibson reacted to this demand from guitarists in dance bands, partly influenced by this craze for Hawaiian music, where the guitarist would actually play a solo, and many of the records were Hawaiian. Apparently one of the, I think it was Paramount Records in the 1920s, sold more Hawaiian-based records than anything else. So there was a massive demand for these big dance bands, and the guitarist had to play solos, sometimes Hawaiian solos. And Lloyd Law, who was working for Gibson at that time, he was their chief designer, he came up with this idea. The idea was that you would once again go back to carving the guitar, made out of very expensive, very selected woods. But the theory being that you wanted as big an area as possible to vibrate. Now, of course, that was prevented by A, having a big hole in the middle, which most guitars had, B, this fingerboard being stuck to the guitar, lots of things stopping the guitar vibrating. Now, he just opened the whole thing up and said, well, we'll lift the fingerboard off the guitar so it's not actually stuck to the top. There's a gap, which you may not be able to see there. And moving the hole from the middle to the sides, much like a violin, which was Orville Gibson's idea, of course. So you've got the massive area that's vibrating, and gradually the body got bigger and bigger. So you have this huge area of arched, carved wood, which vibrated. There were bits of wood inside which you have to have in a guitar to stop it bending. And they were so carefully arranged and graded that he would actually test them to see what note they reacted to when they vibrated. A longer fingerboard, much more versatile guitar. You can play much lower down the guitar, so much more versatile, and that was great for jazz players and dance band players. And this one is the L5, and the L5 was a major breakthrough in guitar design. This one's got a pickup which was out of the 1960s, so it wasn't made as an electric guitar, but it was very easily converted to an electric guitar. Now, what happened after that, this is about 1922 when this came out, is that some of the other makers, like Gretsch and Epiphone, they jumped on this idea and said, oh, great, yeah, but you don't need to charge that much. So they made much cheaper versions of it. And it was 5 or 6 years before Gibson twigged that they were going to lose an awful lot of market unless they made cheap versions. And finally they did. And they came out with things like this. This is a Gibson L4C. This is 1949. That one, by the way, was 1946. They still make these. They started in 1922. They still make them. This one is the L4C. C for cutaway. Gibson had this trick whereby they put a letter at the end of the guitar name and number to indicate its style. C was for cutaway. Other examples, you get T for thin line, you get E for electric, S for Spanish, H for Hawaiian. So even now you get a Gibson that has CES at the end, which is cutaway, electric, Spanish. Spanish being a standard guitar tuning rather than a Hawaiian one. So that was it. This is the L4C 1949. Now, at the same time, Martin, in response to this suddenly much louder guitar. Charles Friedrich Martin, you remember we talked about him earlier, he came out with the idea of having a much bigger body on a standard round hole guitar. And he came out with this series called the Dreadnoughts. It probably wasn't C.F. Martin, it was probably his descendant. They came up with what they call the Dreadnought guitars, named after the old First World War battleships. And they were big, they were massive, they had big square shoulders, and the strutting inside to strengthen the guitar was strategically placed to make it stronger, and you can make it bigger. I think at that time steel strings had become accepted, so it was a big, strong guitar and had a big, big noise. And they dominated the scene for a long time, and still do. Most guitar makers now try and copy the Martin Dreadnoughts. Gibson had to do the same. They couldn't sit back and just let Martin dominate the scene. So although Gibson had come out with these lovely arched top guitars, they had to respond in the same way. They had to make big, round hole, flat top guitars made out of nice wood. This one was made in 1946, which is quite interesting because it's this funny sort of snobbery about guitars that were made during the war. This is a J45, by the way. J for jumbo, because in response to Martin's D for Dreadnought, Gibson called theirs J for jumbo. This is a J45. It's kind of middle of the range guitar. Now, during the war, it was difficult. They weren't allowed to use as much metal as they normally would. Guitar makers were not allowed, well, they couldn't import timbers because the ships couldn't come into America to all these precious woods that they used. So they had to use up old stock of wood. And they were made, generally the quality of the guitar, mainly because the components, was deemed to be not so good during the war. Now, the weird thing about Gibsons was that they tried to compensate for this. There was also a thing about the fact that the Gibson factory didn't close down. What they did was they employed a lot of women to work in the Kalamazoo factory. They were often the wives of former Gibson workers, most of whom, of course, were off serving in the war. And so there's this, it wasn't exactly a stigma. They made a big thing of it, the fact that they were made mostly by women employees. And there's a book called The Kalamazoo Gals, which is all about those years. Now, the funny thing is that to try and convince people that the quality was still good, they put a banner up on here. And the banner on the headstock said, "Only a Gibson is good enough." And that became famous. It was trying to convince people that the quality was good, even if it wasn't. But the really silly thing is that if you buy a guitar that was made during the war by Gibson, up to 1945, it's worth a lot more money than this one, which was made a year later and was once again using very, very good quality timber. It's not worth so much because it hasn't got that banner, so it just doesn't have that sort of label attached to it. These, what they call jumbo guitars now, have been made by so many companies ever since. Here's another example. This is a Gibson 12-string guitar, and this was made in about 1967, I think. 12 strings became very popular in the sort of folk era of the 60s, 50s and 60s. This one's quite interesting because when Gibson made these, they obviously have a lot more tension on the body. And there were a lot of complaints when they first made them because the guitar was bending, the neck was bending, or the bridge was sinking in. So they started issuing them with a little note inside the case saying, "We suggest you tune it down a couple of semitones and then maybe put a capo on to compensate." Anyway, it's quite nice 12 string. How are we doing? We're getting there, aren't we? So we've had a look at these Gibsons. Just as a interesting little deviation, this seeking for more volume took a very interesting little turn around about 1927, when Gibson had been producing these L5 arch tops. Everyone else was copying them. They were big and loud and very, very punchy and pokey. On the country western, the folk scene, these guitar bodies got bigger and bigger and much more resonant, really beautiful sound. But it still wasn't enough. You've still got dance bands. You've got this huge craze for Hawaiian music. And so people were still looking for louder and louder and louder guitars. And then something really weird happened. there was a Czech immigrant, one of four brothers, called John Dopiera. And he was living in Los Angeles, and he had a little workshop where he was making little quirky adaptations to violins and various musical instruments. And he was visited by a guitarist called George Beecham, who was a sort of vaudeville entertainer, but he played Hawaiian guitar amongst other things. And George Beecham said to him, there must be a way that we can make guitars much louder than we do. There must be a new way of looking at it. And he said there must be something we can learn from the Victrola gramophone, whereby the sound vibration was picked up by a very stiff needle, and it was then transmitted to an aluminium disc inside the pickup head on the gramophone arm, and then that was transmitted to a massive horn. And he said, "Is there anything we can do?" And they tried a few ways of doing that. It didn't really work. You can see me in here. If you look at there, this is a sort of T-shaped bridge. And the reason it's that shape is because inside that guitar there are three aluminium cones, one there, and one there. The cones are facing inwards towards the guitar, and the aluminium cones would vibrate from the vibration of the strings, which went straight through the cones and made them vibrate, and then they pushed the sound inside the guitar. And because of that, it didn't matter if the guitar wasn't made of wood. It could be made of anything. And in fact, the harder the material it was made of, the better, because the sound would bounce around inside and then come back out through these grids at the top here. And it was absolutely astonishing. The sound was about twice as loud as any equivalent guitar. He decided if you've got to make them out of metal, why not make them look